Thrilled to be able to introduce and converse with Jennifer Brown of Jennifer Brown Consulting. And she not only is the founder of a well-reputed diversity and inclusion firm, a published author, and a just generally fun and exciting person, but she is also a native Californian.
Yes.
And she hails from behind the orange curtain, which I'll let her explain what that is. And she's also I'm not sure if it's okay to say recovering opera singer.
Yeah,
a recovering opera
absolutely.
singer. And we're going to have a lot of fun talking today. So the format is that I'm going to just ask her a number of questions, and then there's a dory associated with the talk, and anyone who is virtual, we invite you to post any questions you may have up there as well, and then we'll open up to the floor for questions also. So Jennifer, I'd love to ask you to start off by just sharing a little bit about your story.
Okay. So typically where I start about my story is I grew up in a musical family in Southern California. And I was the oldest of 3 kids. And when I was 27, I decided I was going to pursue my love of music full time. So I moved to New York City to make it, as one does, and did opera conservatory. So I got my master's in operatic voice, and that was really what I wanted to do. And one thing led to another in the course of the intense training that one goes through in the opera world. And unfortunately, I injured my voice, and I had to get several surgeries. And the recovery from vocal surgery is that you have to be completely silent for several weeks as your mechanism heals. And when you're finally able to make a sound, all that comes out is a little squeak. And so I worked with speech therapists and kind of coaxed my voice back, but the writing was on the wall, and I knew that I would never be able to really use my instrument in a full-time role as a performer. So it was really heartbreaking to lose my voice, literally, and my creative means of expressing myself and connecting with audiences, which is really what I loved to do. But luckily, friends that had been in the stage and performing world said, why don't you look into the field of corporate training? You know, if you like being in front of people and on the stage, you get to work with people every single day, and that's your job. And I thought, wow, that sounds really fun and right up my alley. So I got another master's degree in something called organizational development, organizational change. Some of you may know it as IO psychology, which is industrial organizational relations. Anything having to do with how organizations function optimally and humans in those organizations. And so that kind of saved my life and gave me, more inspiration to continue and build into the whole field of leadership development. But so P.S., I was meant to use my voice, just not as a singer. And I would come to understand how profound the metaphor of the voice really was for me, because I was also in the LGBT community. So I've had a female partner for 20 years. I've been out since I was 22, and I'm now in my 40s. But I absolutely wasn't using my voice in the workplace in a series of corporate roles. Even as I started my company 10 years ago, I really worried that I wasn't sure how it would go for me trying to sell contracts to people that were different than me. Would they believe what I say? Would they accept me? Would they trust me and my opinion? I mean, I think, and still to this day, there are moments when you wonder, strategically, how much of my full self can I bring into this situation? Does it serve me to share that? Is it a learning point? Is it a teaching point? Or is it just going to distract the conversation? Does it really matter? And it really does matter. It does matter. And if it doesn't matter to me, it certainly matters to people that are looking for more role models that look like me, and that have my story. And so that's what I kind of always come back to is it's important for all of us to stand up and tell our diversity stories. And for me, giving voice to the voiceless in the workplace, and that to me means all diverse talent, i.e. women, people of color, LGBT people, anybody who's doesn't really conform to what a leader looks like in so many companies that I consult to. I believe in them, and I was one of them, and so it's really us, it's not them. And so we dedicate our work at my company to really raising those voices up and also teaching the company why diverse talent is so valuable in so many ways, and bringing that awareness to people. So it's really like, it all, isn't it funny? Like, it makes sense in hindsight when you kind of look at all the pieces of your life and why did things happen the way they did. But I absolutely feel like we're in the sweet spot now, and God knows this conversation is hotter than ever, which we'll talk about today. So we're right in the right spot, I think, to be carrying this message.
Yeah. So I was going to jump in and hit the nail on the head and ask you, as you're talking about finding your own voice and the struggle, your diversity story, you also carry with you the privilege of being able to hide your diversity story.
Right.
And so I'm curious how you navigate the space in which there are people who you're trying to work on behalf of people who cannot hide their diversity story, and how do you build credibility with those people, and how does that come up in the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It reminds me of when I first got into this work. Whether people said it to me or not, I think they wondered, what is a woman that looks like that doing in this work? I mean, and I don't know if that was really said to me all that much, but and it's actually really preposterous that I'm in this work in a crazy way, because I grew up. I also have a lot of class privilege, and I went to very expensive schools, and honestly, I don't think anyone in my family forecast me doing this work. It just wasn't something they even knew about, and that's true for so many of us, I think, that kind of feel called to do this. And coming out was a really big part of that. I have to say, women's studies in college and sort of discovering my feminism was probably even a bigger aha moment for me, growing up in a really traditional family with a really traditional gender roles and expectations of me. So the whole process of kind of casting that aside and kind of striking out on a different path to say, I've got to live true to myself, but I always felt compelled to, if I needed to be a role model, I was ready to do that. And if people needed me to be a champion for them, I was ready to do that. And I think I honestly learned how to do that being in the LGBT community, where we needed champions. I mean, we need our straight ally friends so desperately to even just be safe, let alone have conversations that we can't have on our own behalf. So the way I've come to think about it is, and I don't know how I just show up, and I admit what I don't know. But I also talk a lot about how I have a responsibility to be an ally to others, because I have relative privilege because of certain unearned things about me. Whether that means I can walk, for example, into an executive room and have people listen to me in a different way because they're making stereotypes about who I am, often incorrect, right? Only for me to then reveal, which I think is a powerful aha moment for many people as well. But I see myself as needing allyship, but also providing that and identifying as an ally. And the LGBT community really gave me that language, because I experienced directly what that really meant for a marginalized community. So, I really see it as my job to make sure I'm employing my privilege on others' behalf. And I think, I don't know if workplaces are really gonna figure this diversity and inclusion thing out until we have more people who are thinking about their intersectionality more deeply, and thinking about, what do I have that others need, where I can take the hit maybe, or I can have the tough conversation, or I can be the one that challenges where they can't. And I think if we had more of that going on, we wouldn't be so penalized, those of us who are always the squeaky wheel, who are always bringing up what's said that wasn't appropriate, or challenging somebody's choice about who they pick for a team or who got the job or whatever. It can't always be the woman, the person of color, the gay person, because there's lots of studies that show that it's very, it puts you in a difficult spot. From a perception standpoint, it can actually hurt you. So we're not alone. We're not alone in fighting these battles, but we've got to figure out how to really utilize people around us. And I'd like them to step up and say, I don't need to wait to be asked to do something. I'm going to do something. I'm going to use my privilege, and I'm going to be an ally.
Yeah. I'm curious, you mentioned that you come from a background of class privilege. How do you think that privilege facilitates the work that you do?
Oh my gosh, I love that question, because it's something I wanted to hide. for a really long time.
Yeah.
We talk about, there's a really wonderful research on covering out of Deloitte. I recommend you all read it. It's called Uncovering Talent. And it is the hiding or minimizing, if you can, the minimizing of a stigmatized identity. So some of us can hide it, some of us can't. My class background is something, honestly, that it throws people off, and I don't really talk about it that much. However, my education forced me to write voluminous amounts on all sorts of subjects. It forced me to be on stage in front of hundreds over and over and over again, which means I'm fearless. I mean, I'm really like, you can't stump me, you can't frighten me. I am so resilient. And, you know, part of our output at JBC is like tons of thought leadership. Like we're always writing, we're researching, I'm using a lot of my ability to connect ideas in a way, I think, speaking the language that my readers can absorb and understand. And, you know, honestly, it's that level of polish that you need as a performer is something that I think really helps you deal with the executive level at companies, because, you know, it's a tough place to be. It's challenging. And you have to really hang in there, and you got to build trust quickly. You've got to influence. You've got to establish credibility. You know, you're already a woman walking into those spaces, which are largely male. So I'm already aware that I've got to sort of overcompensate and be like extra perfect. And extra creative, I think, in terms of like, are they listening to me? Is that landing? Do I need to take another tack? Like, do I need a personal story here? Do I need some data here? You know, I like the challenge of it, but I think my background kind of prepared me. And the other thing that prepared me, honestly, is having a really domineering father who's still alive. He's not going to ever watch this. This doesn't leave the four walls of Google, but being the oldest daughter of a very, very dominant male figure, just from a survival perspective, I had to really figure out how I was going to endure that, but what I was meant to learn from it. And it turns out what I was probably meant to learn from it is how to deal with the people I deal with now, which are a lot like my dad. Like, that's kind of, you know, I have to go into those rooms and have those conversations, and, you know, yelling about it, getting upset about it, it's not going to work. You know, it has to be strategic. It has to be very careful. It has to be thoughtful. It has to be respectful, because I think we lose a lot of people if we kind of attack. So I think that honestly prepared me.
So in the middle of all that, you have to show up as powerful. You are a successful businesswoman. Do you struggle with imposter syndrome?
Yes. I work on it a lot. Does everyone know what imposter syndrome is? Sort of like not really earning the place that you're at and the opportunities that you have. And I think some of us do it to ourselves more than others. Women are notorious for playing small, I think. So it's honestly something you have to build the muscle with. And it involves a little bit of drinking the Kool-Aid. It is believing the things that people say to you about what a difference you're making every day. It is actually allowing that stuff to land, you know, instead of pushing it off and saying, oh, they're just saying that, or, you know, that's what we're so good at doing. Oh, it's nothing, you know, minimizing it. You know, I think for us, when you are being successful, you have to let that stuff in, and then you've got to start to believe it to a degree, and you know, being obviously practical and realistic about it. But and really, I mean, it's just like branding. You know, I think brands are always listening to their audience. I am always listening to mine. You know, what is resonating with people? What do they really appreciate about what we're doing? I'm constantly trying to think, how can I be more valuable? What do they need? And how can we be of service? And so I think if you are in service of, far from being called sort of overly confident or self-promoting, you're actually adding value all the time. I mean, my MO as a business owner has always been like, what can I write? What can I write about that's not being written about right now? What can I lend my credibility to and give some weight to, so that people start to talk about something I want them to talk about? And I love having that. That's power, but it's power for good. So I think you just have to look at yourself and say, I have all these tools at my disposal. It's only harming me and the world if I don't use them for the purposes that I judge are important.
Yeah.
And after a while in the same field, you become an expert. I mean, read Malcolm Gladwell when he talks about the mastery. He says 10,000 hours. How many thousands of hours have I spent? I mean, 300 pages was nothing. I was like, oh, I have to stop. It's just like you learn so much. And I think you've got to really just embrace that you are an expert on this stuff, and expertise. I don't even know if 10,000 hours is really needed. Our world is going so fast. We were talking about this last night. To call yourself an expert is even changing now to the point where I think the best experts in a way are people who are present, people who are listening, who are agile, who are responsive, who are willing to challenge norms. So I don't know if it means you have like 5 PhDs. I mean, in what? I think our world is changing so quickly. Mm-hmm. Those of us who are at the top level of these conversations can synthesize, we can connect the dots, we can make people feel heard and seen. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the kind of experts we really want, not the ones that have been in an ivory tower forever and necessarily studying a discipline. Yeah.
And what would you say are some of the successes you're most proud of? When you say this, they have to actually land. You have to let them
land. Oh, yeah. I'd say, well, giving a TED Talk was insane. I'd say, speaking of imposter syndrome, I almost didn't do my TED Talk that fell into my lap. I think I made a lot of excuses about why I wasn't ready or whether I wasn't, I knew I needed to come out in the talk. It was important, and it was important to the organizers, actually. And I was like, So at the time, it was 2010 or 9, and there weren't a lot of out LGBT TED speakers, and there was nobody talking about diversity and inclusion on the TED stage. And it was, it was the wild west of the internet and comment sections, and I just didn't know what would happen. And but even bigger than coming out, I almost didn't do it. And I look back and I think this is what happens to women in particular. We don't think we're ready. We're scared it's not going to be perfect. We think we have to do more homework before we're ready to be that bold. And honestly, I delayed in calling the organizers back. I kind of hemmed and hawed. I procrastinated. And it's really odd behavior for someone like me who so many people want to hear from. And for me to almost say, I'm not ready for that. That makes no sense. Yeah. That's kind of some wiring thing that's going on and a lot of powerful socialization. And when I ended up doing it, I was one of the few women in a lineup of lots of men. So there's probably 2 or 3 women speakers and maybe 10 men. It was at TEDx Presidio, which is right in San Francisco. So big, like 1,000 people. And I asked the organizers, why are there not more women in the agenda? And they literally said, none of the women called us back. All the men got back to us immediately. Note to self. They got back immediately to us, and they got all of their stuff to us so quickly, and they were so self-assured about the message that they were going to give.
Wow.
I know, right?
That is a great anecdote.
It's a crazy anecdote, and I thought to myself, that was almost me, thinking my story wasn't important enough to share. And the crux of the story I shared was honestly the voice story that I just shared, and I thought it was like a nothing story. I just was like, who's going to care? It's just me, poor me. How dare I? I'm so privileged. I get to study opera. So why am I up on this stage talking about this? And I guess what I've found subsequently in telling that story so many times is so many people can see themselves in your story in ways that are not literal. It is a metaphor. And the fact that you're being vulnerable on stage, sharing something that you hid, that you were ashamed of, that broke your heart, that you almost didn't recover from, is so human and so universal. And it was such an important lesson for me too. And as I teach diversity stories now, especially to people who don't think they know anything about diversity, I say you absolutely do know something about this. We just have to find that for you. And then we need to prepare you to tell it in a way that's authentic and connects audiences to you. And my friend says, it's not the pain Olympics. Let's not stack up all of our grievances and say, who has suffered? Yes, some of us have suffered more than others. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that you should be silent, because actually a lot of eyes are on you. And especially for leaders, we are watching leaders. We need to see who you are, not just, your fancy title your big name. It's honestly so much about your diversity story and when you understood exclusion. Right. And most people know something about that.
One of the things that's striking me as you're speaking is a polarity that I'm seeing between power and vulnerability. And I imagine that you have to kind of navigate both, flip between them, stretch between them, whatever it is.
Yes.
And I'm curious if that's a frame that you've thought about at all, or.
I like it. I'm envisioning a graphic that I could like mock up, but it's true. Especially for leaders for whom power meant knowing all the answers, being seen as in charge. The vulnerability was the last thing they wanted to share. And and if any of you don't know Brené Brown's work on vulnerability, she gave a very famous TED Talk, and people nicknamed it the Vulnerability TED. And it was all about her research around vulnerability and what a powerful leadership tool it is that is completely underutilized. And but it's interesting, women being vulnerable is different than men being vulnerable, different than people of color being vulnerable. So the message sort of shifts. I mean, there's a degree of risk of vulnerability for people who are already have less power. So
right.
We got to be aware of that.
Yep.
But people with power, I feel like there's no excuse not to show vulnerability. I mean, that's where I get to be kind of an ass kicker in the boardroom. Like you are safe. Like you're protected. And for you to kind of go out on a limb looks very different than for others to go out on a limb.
Yeah.
And therefore you have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah. And so that kind of leads me into wanting to talk about one of the notions that you cover a lot in your book is the change agent. And so I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about, I feel like we've been dancing around that this whole time that we've been talking without naming it. And so I want to name it and invite you to talk about it a little bit. And how do you define a change agent, and particularly in a corporate space, what is the role of a change agent?
Yeah, I love the term because, a lot of us feel called to challenge the system around us. And wherever you sit in the hierarchy, it doesn't need to be senior. It's a lot of junior people who are creating change from where they are and influencing discussions that are going on, and being allies to their colleagues, volunteering to be part of efforts and initiatives and things like that. So, it's really anyone who takes on the mantle of having courageous conversations, showing up more boldly, speaking on behalf of others when needed, speaking on behalf of themselves, honestly, and showing themselves. So, especially if we have stigmatized parts of who we are, bringing those to the fore, and really leading with them. And for me as a change agent, I think you need to think of wherever you are in the organization, who are you trying to influence, and what are they going to listen to? We have to be really good at having a lot of tools at our disposal. Like I said before, if I'm in an executive room and I want to create change, I like to know, where is everyone on this topic? Where are they from early adopter, totally get it, super enthusiastic, to kind of, apathetic, but listening, to active resistor. Somebody who doesn't show up, somebody who will show up and be combative or challenging, even of the data. And so when you think about, how do I speak to each of these groups differently? A really effective change agent, I think, is somebody who can shift their message and work with the listener. Because if we lose them, we lose our mechanism to create change. But we need to keep them differently. I think it's really interesting work, because to me it's audience analysis, and I enjoy that a lot. I enjoy trying to figure out, where are people, what are the questions they have, what are the triggers for change? I write a lot about that in the book. When companies call us, there's a host of reasons why they call us, because they're ready for change. Can be anything from the CEO came from an Amex and is moving over to, say, a fast growth tech company. And they'll be like, what is going on right now? I came from this company to this company. I went from a totally kind of baked, mature strategy that everybody understood to literally nothing. And so that CEO will say, this is not acceptable. We've got to get on the train. And so they may call us and say, we got to build what I had over there, you got to build over here. Or they may be a very competitive person. They might say, look at their industry ecosystem and say, well, we're behind them, and I'm not okay with that. So we got to catch up. That's also good. I mean, I don't know if I believe it's like the most altruistic reason in the world, but I'll take it. Sometimes it's a personal reason. Sometimes, if it's a male CEO with daughters and, somebody who's been intimately sort of courtside around equal opportunity for women and girls, and has a personal need to leave a legacy that is better than what they're seeing. And sometimes CEOs get really galvanized around like the pay gap, for example. I mean, many companies don't even know what their pay gap is, or they know, but it's like closely guarded in HR and not really shouted from the rooftops. But then you've got like Mark Benioff at Salesforce, who's the CEO there, who's doing some really radical things around pay gap stuff. Like he wrote a check for $3 million just to gross up pay for all the people that were underpaid. And that was kind of just his first salvo in the conversation. And then, at the same time, sort of tackling the systemic problems that led to that. So everybody's sort of on this big, long continuum. And I think you've got to meet your organization where they're at. You've got to meet your manager where they're at. You've got to meet your team where they're at. Start local. Start to suggest that we have open dialogue about this stuff and, build a container for it. Somehow, think about, there's a lot of suggestions in here about what you can do at your level, whatever that is, to create change. But know that that the big organizations need sort of pretty sophisticated structures to really shift a culture towards inclusion. I mean, it's one of those things that it's fascinating. How does a huge company that is growing and surviving and dealing with new markets and everything sort of shift towards inclusion? It's way more complex than like hiring and fixing your problem by hiring X number of this, and this, right? Who, by the way, won't stay if your culture isn't inclusive. So you've kind of solved one part of the problem, but then you haven't like actually adjusted the culture so that they will stay and grow and thrive.
So that's actually a segue into a question that I had for you. And there's a quote in the book where you write, great intentions at the top of the house and even great actions, like we've seen publicly where companies are taking a stand politically, whether it's against a Muslim ban or Black Lives Matters or issues that are coming up in the news, and companies are taking public stands against those. Great actions at the top of the house, great scores on all the indices and lists, and a whole host of awards do not guarantee a healthy culture for all. There's a big difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. And so what is your recipe for moving a company to walking the walk?
You love the hard questions.
Told you it wasn't going to be easy.
Like it. No, I love it. Yeah. Well, so what happens is companies can buy a lot of really fancy marketing. They can even be really well-intentioned and actually really active in social issues. Although I have to say, most companies don't say anything about what's going on in the political realm, Black Lives Matter, the Muslim ban. I mean, most were silent. And I can tell you that a lot of employees were walking around feeling really jittery and distressed, and that they had to kind of hide all of that as they came into work, in the last 6 months at various junctures, depending on what has been happening in the last year and a half, actually. So I think until leadership especially realizes that it's not always about the grand public gesture, although they actually need to do that more, and that's nowhere near as widespread as I like to see it. Even just the email to an all hands, even the inclusion of an honest discussion about inclusion, even town halls and dialogues and just a space to talk about it is something that I think a lot of legal departments are jittery about. In most of now here maybe not, but a lot of the companies I work with they want to stay away from it. But the silence really speaks volumes, and I know that people are looking for leadership in those times to really speak about what I want to hear is, why am I important to you working here? Like, it's really human. It's very much, am I seen? Am I heard? Am I understood? Even if leadership doesn't look like me, and even if it's not from my community, which typically it's not, I still want to hear those messages, and I want them to be heartfelt and authentic and vulnerable. And even if leaders don't have all the answers, they need to say, I don't have all the answers, and yet I'm committed to finding them out together. Just something like that. It is not about taking political stands. I think a lot of companies stayed quiet because they thought there was just no way to talk about these things without coming out on one side or the other. And it wasn't about that. I think inclusion and inclusiveness is sort of a universal topic that we can all talk about. So I think to walk the talk, it's got to be heartfelt. It has to be. We've got to have the hard conversations inside and not just go for the big pop on the external metrics. Although we need to do more of that too, trust me. I mean, vast majority of companies aren't doing anything on any of these lists. So
I have a whole set of other questions that I'm dying to ask you, but I also want to open up the floor to anyone else that wants to ask questions, either on the live stream or in the room.
We'd love to hear from you.
And I'm happy to keep going if no one's thought of anything yet to ask. But
I see a lot of shaking heads out there, though.
Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask? Okay, wait, let's get you a mic because we need to have that for the recording.
That's right.
Hello, hi, I'm
Hello.
Kashima. You quoted several books and people that you follow on TED Talks and whatnot, and so I was just wondering, are there certain people that influenced you? I mean, I know your father was a major influencer.
Maybe for not the right reasons.
And, things happening with your voice or whatnot, but were there certain people that you followed and looked up to that helped you to get to where you are now?
Boy, that's a great question. Well, I'd probably say there's some leading chief diversity officers that I've had the privilege to work with in so many different companies that I've worked in that are fearlessly leading their company with not a lot of resources. It's a really, really hard job to do these jobs. You constantly are sort of in doubt in terms of the legitimacy of what you're actually doing, and there's so much pushback. So you spend like so much of your time trying to figure out like, how do I again steer the ship and get it to move. So I was always following this diversity leaders at companies like IBM and Wells Fargo and a lot of financial services companies, honestly, who've been doing this for a really long time. Longer than the tech space, and I think more deeply and more widely. They've sort of baked it into their structure, and so I've learned a lot from those really advanced cultures that have been going after this for a long time. And listening to CEOs who talk about diversity and inclusion and sort of carefully monitoring how do they talk about it, so that I can then take that and teach other CEOs and executives how to talk about it. Jim Turley, who was the CEO of Ernst & Young, was a really amazing guy, especially on LGBT rights. And he was a straight, white, cisgender man leading this massive global company that was very, very adamant about LGBT equality and gender equality in his workforce. And so just getting to interview him on the stage was really cool. And honestly, it's kept me going because those people like him give me hope that there are more of them out there that they're on the learning curve, they're on the journey, they need to be either awakened or equipped or maybe made comfortable with being, a spokesperson for these things. So I think meeting people like that has been really transformative for me because I know that it can happen. We need to create more of them. And that's the big thing that keeps me up at night is how do I ignite leaders that look like him to speak about these things so that it makes it safe for the rest of us to really show up and bring our full selves to work, because that's going to really shift it.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question. If anyone has a question, raise your hand and we'll get you the mic. But it's interesting to hear you say that the financial services industry has been doing this work for a long time and deeply, because that's not necessarily an industry that I would think of as like a particularly inclusive industry. Yeah. So I'm curious it's like interesting to hear you say that, and I'm curious what the impact of that investment has been in those companies. What do you see when you're in there doing that work?
Right. Well, I mean, you see a lot of employee resource groups that are really huge. Like they're just massive. Like they have tens of thousands of people in them, kind of big, with they're sort of a city unto themselves with their own org charts. They have lots of executive buy-in. There's sort of multiple levels of steering committees and like executive councils and in different parts of the business. So it's really baked out. If you were envisioning it, it's got arms and legs at different levels, and especially the penetration, I think, to the senior levels. And they, Wells Fargo, for example, is investing in diverse talent by graduating thousands of diverse leaders through a particular leadership development program that is just for each segment. And I'm involved in their LGBT program where we've graduated 500 high potential leaders. I'm not seeing that in tech. We need it desperately. We need it in every single industry. It doesn't matter which one, and the fact they've graduated thousands of Black leaders through their high potential program. And these are people that are mid-career. They're in that really critical time where they need to kind of sit back in a homogeneous group and say, here's what's getting in the way for me, for my career. And here's my peers. And we share these experiences. How can we kind of think about shortcutting this where their bias is showing up, or who can we leverage on the plus side that is supportive of, like, who's your mentor, who's your sponsor, could I have lunch with that person? So the whole networking thing that happens amongst these communities behind closed doors shores up that community. It gives that community a voice and gives them confidence. And it makes them feel important to the company. So
and
it's like this really cool thing.
Is it moving them up
Yes,
in the
it
leadership
is.
ladder?
It is. The promotion. So the promotion rates for Wells coming out of these programs are like way higher than average promotion rates for people who haven't been through them. So to me, I interpret that as it's sort of it's the lift, it's the investment, it's the deep dive into our journeys, but it's a safe space to talk about those things. And for the LGBT community, the conversations are around authenticity, bringing your full self to work, how exhausting it is to cover and minimize your life in front of your customers, in your branch, in the Midwest or wherever they are. It's a really honest conversation. Or we talk a lot about, if you're lesbian, not looking like maybe, I don't know, like not fitting somebody's idea of what a successful woman leader looks like, or a gay man saying, I get this feedback around how I speak or how I gesture. I mean, it's really ridiculous stuff, but it's real. And I think we're still fighting against this monolithic idea of what a leader looks like, and a lot of us don't fit in that. And so bias is still keeping us from achieving what we really should, but we've got to take control of that and name it, and then kind of be really savvy about how we navigate around it, through it.
Yeah.
Using our allies to help us, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So kind of off of what you were saying around the shift in what a leader looks like, my question is around, we're shifting away from or hoping to shift from bias of what a leader previously looked like, but isn't this still in a way a construct of how a leader should show up? And thinking about inclusivity and bringing your full self to work, if someone's not necessarily extroverted or the type who feels comfortable to be sharing these types of stories, how do you mitigate that balance of making sure we're inclusive in a leadership group, but also having the responsibility to show up in the way that you've described?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. That's a tough one. True. Yeah. I have to think about that a little bit more. It's true that this is a little bit of an extrovert's model, right? It's especially hard to expect an introvert or somebody who's a little more analytical to even come to the table with their story, and vulnerability means something totally different to that person and feels like way more risky. I think that's very true. My friend Woki Nabweze, I have a podcast, and Woki was on my podcast, and she has the Seen and Heard project, and she describes it as being she's the quiet girl. And Seen and Heard is all about the quiet voices, right? So that we're not ever going to be the one that's on the edge of the stage, maybe being that loud leader or the expressive leader, but we're going to lead in a different way, and yet we still have an opportunity to lead and stretch. So what does our edge look like when that's our profile? And I guess my answer would be that how can a leader who's a quieter leader, or someone who leads from behind, or someone that's analytical, still work their edge, which is really the biggest point. And by the way, showing up that way is going to resonate with people that need to see that leader showing up that way. right? So I think I always say, if we're not uncomfortable on a regular basis, from wherever we're starting, we're not probably doing our work, and so, but the definition of what uncomfortable looks like feels different for all of us. So, but yeah, I really appreciate that question. It doesn't look the same for everyone. Quiet advocacy, noisy advocacy, I think, leading when no one's looking. And yet you can be an incredibly inclusive leader in a quiet way by the questions you ask, the listening that you provide, the way that you represent inclusion, that maybe nobody ever sees, but that they experience the impact of. And that's beautiful and important. I would say get others to tell your story. And that's why I tell Wokie's story, because that's my way of signaling to people that you have a role as well. It's really important, and that's going to shift the reality for other people that may not be shifted by me and my style, but may be shifted by you.
So that's actually a great transition to another question that's kind of percolating for me. And again, raise your hand if there's a question, we'll get you the mic. But in the meantime, I'll fill the space with my question,
Okay.
which is, how do you dance between fighting to establish your credibility and your power and being the voice, exerting your voice, and also creating a space for other people to exert their voice who maybe have less power? Like, how do you navigate that?
Oh, I love that question. Oh man, it's so true. Well, we all have a different style. So I am actually, even though I keynote a lot, I'm actually more of a question asker versus a talker. I'm more of I love focus groups. I love interviewing people. I like my podcast, not because I get the platform, but because I can give other people the platform. So, but there are some times when I'm called to be the definitive voice, the one with the credibility, the one that wrote the book. Even though I will say, the book is nowhere near, and it couldn't ever be, sort of a perfect solution. It's just one person's lens and experience. So I think as a change agent, we need to understand, what does this moment need of me? How can I be in service right now? Is it to listen? Is it to support others? Or is it to come through with the statement or the power, show the power? Really. And I don't even mean we can show power just with our bodies and our voice and our presence. I'm very conscious of using the power differently. If I'm walking into a room with employee resource groups and it's it's lively and open and informal, how does my power need to show up in that in a very different way? But if I'm walking into a room with executives, how you walk in, how you speak, how you use your voice, what you say really matters, because in my experience, you meet power with power, frankly. So you've got to learn how to kind of get your grounding in that kind of room, and use your vulnerability, but you're always watching and how to be savvy about it, right? It's a tool in your arsenal. You can't fall apart in an executive meeting. I mean, this is part of, I think, owning your story. When I gave my TED Talk, I thought, how am I going to get up on that stage and not cry? I was like, am I going to get through my talk? And I was really worried about that. But as you make your stories your tool, you learn how to protect yourself at the same time as you are being vulnerable. And you're reliving something that happened to you, but you're always mindful and kind of watching from a distance to see, how is this going over? I'm giving you guys all of my tricks, but this is honestly, but this is kind of how I think about it, because your stories become your tools, and bringing them out strategically and at the right moment, leads to a sense of power and mastery that I think has been really, honestly, surprising for me. It's been really healing, actually. Yeah. It's just to tell it over and over, and for me to be reinforced by audiences that they're telling me, you're enough. And to feel that over and over again is so, I've been adding that to me and the strength that I carry around. Yeah. So honestly, I feel like every time I feel I'm in community, I feel strengthened. I mean, I was just at Pride in New York, and that's just such a wonderful experience to realize how much power is around you and behind you, in front of you, and has gone before you historically. So I personally like to really tap into to that and know that I'm just part of like a river, and I'm in it. And all my job is just to keep kind of grabbing what I can, passing it along where I need to, channeling some messages that, maybe I channel in a certain way, and seen through my lens, it's going to sound different to someone. But I got to keep trying, and that's kind of what it feels like. But there's a real flow. There's a flow to it once you get into it. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah. So we have 1 minute left. I want to make sure that anyone who's in the room knows that you can get a free book, one of Jennifer's free books. If you, we don't have them here with us today, but if you can write your LDAP down, I will communicate with you when they arrive, and we'll figure out how to get it to you. So I'm going to make sure to ask you to sign on this before you go. And
We have one more question.
one more question.
Yes, absolutely.
Hi. Okay, cool. My name is Marina, and I lead a diversity initiative with my vendor team. And one of our main difficulties right now is building a diverse pipeline. We don't have enough resources to hire someone who could tell us what to do or not to do. So right now I rely a lot on materials that I find online and studies. And I wanted to know if you can give me any tips for small companies or teams that don't have a lot of resources, how can we build a more diverse team?
The vendor pipeline you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
And the hiring on the vendor side, like their own hiring?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it is difficult. You're constrained geographically from, and what age are you hiring? Like out of school or more experienced hires? All of the above?
Yeah, all of the above.
Yeah, because the answer is kind of different when you're looking at, young hiring out of schools. We always say, are you looking at a broad array of schools? Are you sort of throwing the job description away and thinking more broadly about the kinds of capabilities that you're looking for to the non-traditional talent? And that means hiring across difference. Usually if your founder team is largely maybe say white and male or Asian and male, it's going to mean that they have to be committed and I wouldn't say take a risk, because I don't believe it's risky to hire outside of your own image, but they will believe that it is. And so, how do we help them understand that actually hiring in your own image can harm your ability to be innovative and to generate that creative abrasion that happens from that diversity of talent? And I think you've got to start with that resistance, maybe there, to then kind of, taking some leaps of faith and looking in under corners that you wouldn't have normally. And, even going so far as to say, I don't want to interview if the pipeline I have a friend, Adam Pizzoni, who founded Yammer. I don't know if any of you know who he is. He sold to Microsoft. His next startup, he refuses to interview white straight men like him. So literally they're not even getting into the pipeline. He refuses. He said, if we let any of that happen, it's going to end up that our founding team, which is an education startup, by the way, so serving schools, is going to be, again, kind of largely male. And he's like, I'm not okay with that. And so I've got to take some drastic action about even who I let into the pipeline to be interviewed, because there's so many male candidates that come his way and not a lot of diverse candidates. And so he's had to literally kind of say to the team, like, this is a non-negotiable for me, because this founding team is so important, because who you hire is then going to send a signal to your next hires and your next hires and your next hires. So literally what you do when you're small really, really matters, because it will make your job so much easier in the future. So you have to be uncompromising. You might want to, put some metrics in place, and then, think outside the box. Watch out also for gendered language in job descriptions. Really interesting. There's some fascinating startups that are going on. Unitive is one. Text.io is one, that it literally goes through and looks at your job descriptions and flags gendered language. And that keeps basically women and non-traditional candidates away from even applying for things. So the way that we describe roles is gendered and begins that process of bias that screens, people self-screen out, because if you're looking for a rock star coder, you're using all this kind of language, and women are like, it's not me. I see myself in that.
Especially if you're an introvert.
Especially if you're an introvert. Exactly. And you might be brilliant introvert. So it really, there's so many places bias occurs, I think, that keeps your pipeline from being welcoming to even think of themselves as applying. And so it's a long, one can talk afterwards. There's a lot more ideas. And there's a lot of ideas in here too, how to do it.
Well, with that, we're going to have to end, unfortunately,
Yes.
but thank you very much for
Thank
the
you,
rich
guys.
conversation.
Thank you for
Thank you all
coming.
so much for coming.
So good to
and
see you all.
looking forward